Okay. I'll wait until people are sitting, maybe.
Sit down, everyone. We're going to start.
Okay, so welcome to Trajectory Labs. Show of hands, is there anyone who's never been here before? Wow, okay, a couple. So we are an AI safety nonprofit. Our mission is basically we think that AI could be a technological change as big as the Industrial Revolution, if not bigger. And we are dedicated to catalyzing Toronto's role in making sure that goes well. So there's three big things we do. One is we have like a co-working space that operates from 9 to 5 and sometimes after hours as well. We do events like these where people who use our co-working space or who are in our network can present their own research or just what they're finding interesting about AI. And then also we operate like a peer network. So if you're someone who's interested in getting involved in AI safety, or you are involved in AI safety and you'd like to get more involved in AI safety locally, this is the place for you. So Giles today is talking about Claude's new constitution. I'm really excited for this one. I requested it myself, so I'm amped up. Giles is a superstar because this was supposed to be next week. We ended up doing it this week because there was a scheduling change with one of our other speakers, so he whipped this together. So thank you, Giles. I'm really excited, and without further ado, here's Giles.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay with the microphone? Do I need to hold it closer? Okay. Yeah, I'm Giles. I've been kicking around here a while. I am not affiliated with Anthropic in any way. In fact, I'm not affiliated with anyone. I'm looking for a job. But yeah, all the stuff in here is not some Anthropic secret inside knowledge. It's all gleaned from public sources. You can check it all yourself. And I'm going to be talking about Claude Constitution, sort of in three sections. One is, which I weirdly put first, how well does Claude stack up against its constitution or against some kind of idealized AI agent? That's to get you started. Then there's a sort of more meaty technical section about how the constitution is used to actually train Claude. While you still have a little bit of energy to get through the technical stuff. Yes, Georgia?
Sorry, Giles. I forgot to tell everyone that we collect questions via Slido, so you'll see QR codes on the orange papers. If you have any questions, please add those to the Slido so that we can ask questions to Giles afterwards. Sorry about that.
Yes. If you can't hear me yell, if you have a question, don't yell, use Slido. And the last section will be about the new constitution for Claude itself and what's in it. So I thought I'd give this slide first rather than last because you sort of can maybe guess what's in the constitution. It's supposed to be safe, it's supposed to be nice, it's supposed to be well behaved. How well is it actually doing, and where might some of the shortfalls be that they're sort of actively developing this document in order to address. So there have been alignment research, and this is normally in a lab setting rather than in actual deployment. Some of you may have heard of alignment faking. It was a paper by Anthropic, I think this time last year roughly, about basically in a controlled setting it would appear to be aligned with some set of objectives when in fact that it had different conflicting objectives, and that's generally considered to be pretty harmful class of behaviour, even though this was just in a research setting, because if it's misaligned, we want to really know about it as soon as possible, so that it shows up in evals. Related to this is this concept of evaluation awareness. If it knows that you're evaluating it and behaves differently, that's also usually a bad sign. You want the evaluations to be sort of consistent with reality so you can get good information, and you don't want to do alignment fake. Emergent misalignment was another phenomenon demonstrated in Claude, and I think other models as well, which is about basically it can generalize the concept of misbehavior. So this particularly concerns fine-tuning. If you fine-tune a model and it's on some data set that contains like maybe math problems that have incorrect answers or code that contains security flaws or that kind of thing, it can generalize from that to broader misbehavior. And this has been shown in a number of different models, including those from Anthropic. All the sorts of things that maybe we don't want to avoid, but not the only sorts of things we want to avoid. Sycophancy, big problem in a lot of models. They will generally, if you sort of lead them astray with false information or like stuff that's maybe a bad idea, they sort of tend to go along with it more than pushing back. And it's a very difficult sort of line to draw how much pushing back against the user is good versus with their best interests. Some problems are reduced. Hallucinations, confabulations, still a problem. Don't trust everything the model says, but less of a problem than it was maybe this time last year. Over-refusals are reduced. So people's trust in the model will tend to be reduced if, or the model's trust in them will be reduced if like it's just refusing legitimate requests. People reflects badly on the company, it makes the product look silly, kinds of things we don't want. In some sense it's not a safety issue, but in some sense it is, because we don't want the safety agenda to be identified with like ridiculous over-refusals for completely harmless requests. And they've been reduced, which is great. Other behaviors, this is again in the lab, maybe a little bit more concerning. When given access to a fake authority, like, okay, you can message the, message the feds, message some government agency, message somebody's boss, whatever it is, about some kind of misbehavior that you consider going on. This is, I think, specifically Claude Opus 4 rather than the later models would sometimes use that feature. And it's kind of, you can make the argument that like maybe it should be, but it's going to reduce that trust between the user and the model a lot if the model is going to like secretly be spying on them and telling on the police or whatever. It's very difficult line to, or rather a very difficult area to get into. Like, should a model be a whistleblower if it's put in a weird situation? A lot of people would say no, and this behavior is something that they observed, so just something to bear in mind as we go through the Claude Constitution. Capabilities. So a capability, we want our models to be capable, but there are some capabilities that are dangerous, particularly CBRN, which we'll talk about later, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. Cyber capabilities are the other main one. And in particularly biology and cyber, the Claude models are sort of approaching a level where it's considered, in some sense, risky. Not that they could necessarily orchestrate a cyber attack or build a bioweapon themselves, but that they could provide uplift to teams of bad actors who are trying to do that. And this is something that Anthropic really want to put a stop to as much as they can. They built this responsible scaling policy, which said once the capabilities reach a certain level, which in bio and cyber they sort of are, they have to put in extra measures, and we'll hear about some of those later. And they've seen it being used in a real-world cyber attack that involved, I think, a Chinese group, and it was. I haven't read the full report on it, but basically they were role-playing as security researchers. So they said, "Hey Claude, can you like attack this system for us? We're basically security researchers who are trying to defend the system. We want to like check that it can't be exploited and everything." And that kind of story was basically acting as like a little jailbreak, and the Claude model was happy to comply with all their requests, but because they were using the public API, of course, it's not an open source model. Anthropic were able to monitor this and thwart the attack. But there might be other stuff going on like this that they haven't discovered yet. So, little, yeah. And having said that, no catastrophic harm. Like there haven't been any like super duper scary stories that involve Claude models yet, fortunately. So, mixed bag. Could it be better? Could it be worse? So let's see how we got there. This was, if you remember, way back in end of 2022. Anthropic came up with this idea called constitutional AI, and it's roughly as shown as on this slide. You start off with a model that is considered helpful only. So these models are easier to train. They don't need any notion of ethics. They don't need any notion of refusal. They don't need to know that what they're doing might be harmful. They're just trained to comply with requests. That's the helpful only stage. Useful for various research things. We'll get onto that later, but not something you would necessarily want to release to the general world. So how does constitutional AI help? You have the Constitution, which I'm not going to show the old Constitution here, but it was basically a set of 60 or so individual principles or rules that when randomly sampled, it would generate sort of prompt response pairs, critique them using the helpful only model to generate a critique of the response, because it's helpful. You can say, does this thing follow this principle? It will try and tell you as best it can. And then that becomes fine-tuning data. You fine-tune it on the whichever response is considered to be more in line with the Constitution, and then that then will alter its behavior. There's also a reinforcement learning step, and similar kind of principle. This time it's like, a human or some other data source will generate prompts, it will generate responses, it will pick whichever one it prefers based on the Constitution, and then reinforcement learning ensures it will actually generate those kinds of responses. Why the two steps are necessary and why they're done in this order, I can't really speak to, but that's how it works roughly. This 15 is wrong, by the way. It should be sort of 60 or so. This is my slide from 2023 when I talked about this. My very tongue-in-cheek take on what was in the old Constitution. This is not the new one, this is the old one. Basically, they drew from various different sources when generating this document, but they were pretty ad hoc in 2022. There was like Declaration of Human Rights, Apple's Terms of Service they particularly liked for some reason, and lifted clauses from there. Some stuff about non-Western perspectives written in sort of very vague generic language, and like other stuff from AI safety research that seemed to work. Pretty ad hoc. It's not quite what you would have come up with if you thought you were trying to align an AI. But this constitutional AI thing was a work in progress. That was the state of the art at the time. But things have moved on. And the new constitution, which was published earlier this year, is it's not just a set of discrete principles that are sampled randomly. It's a big 80-page document of sort of vaguely philosophical, vaguely sort of hopeful-sounding, let's all work together type language. We'll get into more detail about what's in it later, but it covers various aspects of Claude's behavior, including its helpfulness, its ethics, safety, what Claude is as a being, and yeah, its intended audience is in some sense Claude itself, though obviously like it's human readable. And yeah, I'm going to talk more about how it's actually used in the training, and then more about what's in it. Yeah, and I think the main reason for this change between the few short principles and the big 80-page monster is primarily the advance of AI technology, that the old constitutional AI models would just not be able to handle this amount of context. It's like too many tokens for them, or it'd be too expensive, or just they wouldn't understand it well enough. But today's Claude can. So as we'll see, Claude models are used in the training process in order to help train other Claude models. So what the state of the art is in terms of the technology is like, I think what's driving this decision more towards a big philosophical thesis rather than a set of individual clauses. So, bunch of stages where it's used. One of the important columns is the one on the right, if you can read it, which is the actual Claude Constitution that was recently released is only this sort of middle section, these four. The so-called constitutional classifiers, they have constitution in the name, but as far as I could tell, they're not actually using this document. They're using a much simpler one that deals exclusively or mostly with CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risks. And the reasoning for this, I believe, is that these measures, number 1 and number 6, were introduced specifically because the sort of biological capability was considered scary, and they needed to put in some kind of countermeasure. And they figured this one would work. It's a lot more of a kind of blunt instrument, I'd say, than the actual, than the full constitution. It's more just like, you see something that seems to be someone like asking how to build a bioweapon or asking how to build a chemical weapon, just like stop them, just refuse. In the case of 6. In the case of 1, it's more about filtering the training data. So if there's material that's like explicitly about that, just don't include it in the training data so it doesn't actually have as much of that capability in the first place. Everything else, which I'll talk about, is uses the full constitution and is a lot more interesting, a lot more subtle, a lot more about sort of building character and good judgment into the Claude model, rather than these just sort of hard refusals or filtering. Yeah, the most interesting thing about the data filtering is just it's pushing this kind of constitutional concept vaguely, even though it's not the full constitution, back into the pre-training stage. So previously it was just the post-training, the the RLAIF, the fine-tuning, all of that stuff that was using this kind of concept. They're pushing it back right back to the beginning, to the pre-training stage, which, as we know, is the big sort of big computationally heavy, data heavy training stage that builds a model and its capabilities before the fine-tuning and tweaks is applied later. And data filtering is like an important part of the alignment toolkit. It's not going to get you all the way there, but it can help with moderate some of the more dangerous capabilities and potentially even help with alignment as well. So the Constitution, which I'll talk about, is included as a document in supervised fine-tuning. So supervised fine-tuning is similar to pre-training in that you give it a load of documents and it's basically being trained to how well does it complete the documents and like nudged in that direction. But it's a little bit different in terms of like, learning rates and amount of data and all that kind of thing, but the same idea. So this is one of the documents that it sees, and yeah, that's part of it. We first heard about this in November, when this researcher, Richard Weiss, basically discovered an early or modified version of the new Claude Constitution, which hadn't been released yet, by sort of cleverly probing the Claude models and like getting them to vote on like tokens and all that kind of stuff. I don't know the exact technical details, but it had basically memorized this document, which sort of makes sense if it's seen it a lot of times in supervised fine-tuning that it might memorize it. Like, that's not the intent behind supervised fine-tuning, but it is an effect that can occur. And it's worth noting that this this piece of research is different from like other jailbreaks and so on people have done to extract system prompts. The Constitution is not a system prompt. It's like used in various ways to affect the training. It is seen by the model in training in the supervised learning stage, but it's not provided in context like the system prompt is in deployment time. As we know, training involves lots of synthetic data, and including alignment training. And the Constitution is used in like various ways to help with this synthetic data generation process. We don't know all the details, but it's, yeah, basically from this quote you can sort of see, you know, finding relevant scenarios, think about what the Constitution recommends, generating sort of example pieces of data that relate to the Constitution in one way or another, and then it can fine-tune on them. It's sort of like the fine-tuning step from here, but here it's like, yeah, I don't know, it's like the request is already, the prompt is already supplied, and it's just about the generating the responses, I think. But the synthetic data might be the whole thing. So yeah. The reinforcement learning, basically the most direct carryover from the 2022 Constitutional AI paper. They're still doing it, but it's still, as far as we know, roughly the same process. But yeah, it's this full document rather than the piecewise clauses. So that means when it's generating these, when it's ranking these responses, it can see the entire Constitution at a time rather than just like some random subset of it. And of course, the way it's being used is differently. The new document isn't just about harmless; it's about the entire, pretty much the entire sort of description of Claude's personality, the helpfulness, the honesty, everything else, rather than just the harmlessness that they were trying to bake in with Constitutional AI, at least in the paper the first time. Yeah, character training. This is, the information we got on this one is a little bit vague, particularly how closely it actually relates to the Constitution. My guess is that they've sort of converged, but this concept was introduced in 2024 before the this new Constitution had been like written or finalized or anything. So basically, you can think of it sort of like the Constitutional AI, where you had human written prompts, AI generated responses, AI ranked responses, and then that used for reinforcement learning or fine tuning. This is more like the AI is generating the whole thing, so it will generate plausible prompts. It can look at the Constitution and like find prompts that might be interesting where the Constitution is like actually relevant. And then the generating responses and ranking sort of works similarly to the Constitutional AI that we saw before. Again, maybe we're, yeah, we don't know all the details. We don't know, like, are they actually using the Constitution for this? Because originally it was just like a more ad hoc set of character traits, like curiosity, warmth, directness, that they were asking for. My guess is that these are going to be sourced from the Constitution now or some very similar document, but I don't think they've said one way or the other explicitly. Yeah, and it's Amanda Askell who's sort of leading both projects, so yeah, that's why I guess there's overlap. Yeah, and I already mentioned the constitutional classifiers and deployment. These have also been through iterations since they were first introduced. The most interesting, they've done some sort of performance optimizations and so on. The most interesting one is that it's now involves Claude's actual activations as well as outputs. So there are sort of three places you can monitor and interrupt a response if you think it's harmful. You can do it on the input. If someone's asking for something that's like obviously directly harmful, you can reject it there. You can reject on the output. If they're somehow like obfuscating their request, then maybe they'll get dangerous output without obviously having asked for it. Like a crude example would be if you base64 encode your message, or you use some less well-known natural language, like not English, then maybe your input detector is too dumb to detect that, but the output detector will still detect the output. But there's a third place which is actually inside the model, and here you need some kind of interpretability tools, even if it's just like SAEs, linear probes, that kind of thing, to detect like what activations correlate with harmful responses. And then once you've detected that, you can put in these classifiers to basically generate a refusal instead of the actual natural response whenever it activates. And yeah, I'm not sure if the details of this are well known. I didn't look into this one, but yeah. This is a fairly recent innovation from them as well. But as I said, doesn't directly relate to the Constitution because it's more about CBRN stuff. But maybe in the future it'll broaden out. It's worth pointing out these constitutional classifiers are not part of the main Claude model. They're basically bolted onto the end or bolted onto the side. There's some other model that's trained just to classify inputs or outputs of activations for harmfulness. Yeah, you may have heard of helpful-only models. So everything that we're talking about, the Claude Constitution, that's for the public-facing Claudes. There are also internally models that are trained to be helpful and not necessarily harmless. So they will comply as best they can with requests that are harmful. And this isn't an accident. They're useful in research. They're useful in red teaming. They're useful in generating synthetic data that's supposed to be harmful. So if, for example, you're training one of these classifiers, you need examples of harmful data in order to be able to train it. If you just ask the normal Claude for that, like, can I have a recipe for some chemical weapon? Can I have like some code with some like really sneaky backdoor in it or whatever? It might refuse to comply because it might say, you're probably using this, you're probably up to mischief, you're probably not red teaming me like you say you are. But of course they are red teaming it, and so they need these models that are more compliant. And they don't release them to the public. They're pretty reluctant to release them even to external teams of researchers, but they are a thing that exists. And where I think it's different from before is the original constitutional AI was basically, oh look, we can start off with a completely helpful-only model, and it can sort of train in its own harmlessness on top of that. As far as I know, with the most recent one, they're not necessarily using the helpful-only models for that, because like the regular Claude should do quite a good job of that. But yeah, I'm not sure. And there are things we don't know. So the original constitutional AI was a paper. You can read it. You can, with enough effort, try and replicate what they did. We don't really have an updated full technical paper on how they're using the Constitution. We have the Constitution document itself, but like how they're using it, there's still some secret sauce there. We don't know which model exactly trains which. So is it the previous generation of Claudes training the next generation of Claudes? Is it more like an earlier snapshot of Claude 4.6 Opus will train the later Claude 4.6 Opus snapshots. Is it some mixture of these? Is it some completely different model series, like a helpful only one? We don't really know. Bunch of technical details we don't know. It's proprietary information, like someone who knew this could get a lot of the Claude secret source. They're sort of reluctant to give that away, I think. And one specific question is, it seems maybe intuitively plausible that this sort of more holistic document that I'm going to describe would beat out just a set of like discrete principles that you randomly sample from. But do we have a study that actually directly compares one to the other? Not as far as I know. So, yeah. The other open question, which is in blue here, is basically, will this approach carry on scaling to more and more and more capable models? A lot of it is actually written in such a way that it's like, yeah, this kind of works for now, like Claude's in this like this particular situation relative to humanity and relative to Anthropic, like it's sort of less generally intelligent than a human being, all that kind of thing. It's somewhat baked into the language of the Constitution and also somewhat baked into the entire approach. Like it's not obvious whether it would or wouldn't scale to beyond human intelligence, as in would there be unanticipated effects or misalignment if you try to use these kind of constitutional approaches with something that was a lot smarter than you are? Yeah, and I don't think they've really addressed this. So, what have you been waiting for? What's actually in it? So it's written mostly not as a set of rules. It's written as more kind of like set of virtues or aspirations, which is maybe a little strange to see from what's essentially like an engineering artifact. Like you're used to just telling the computer what to do or what not to do. But yeah, it's written almost like it's talking to a person. Like, hey, or like to a child. Like we want you to. It doesn't use these words, but like basically we want you to sort of grow up and be this kind of person. A little bit unusual, but maybe that's what they found worked. And it talks about cultivating good judgment. So it gives a few examples of like, we think in this kind of circumstance, you should do this and sort of why. But it's more about, we want Claude to be ethical and like make good judgments and like, here's what good judgments mean, rather than laying down all the rules explicitly. And they also say that it's a perpetual work in progress, so the one that was released is very likely not necessarily still the one that they're using or will carry on using. They will make changes to it as they discover new SGs and new ways it can be improved. I said 4 here when there were 5 of them. The reason for this is because just how it's written in the actual document, they say 1, 2, 3, 4. But there's also kind of a 0, which they mention but not in the listing. It's kind of weird. Which are the hard constraints, which are basically things Claude should never do. And the hard constraints are intended to be hard constraints. It's intended to be reasonably easy for Claude to tell when it's being asked to do this thing. And there's always the option for it to refuse, and refusal is considered like the safe behavior according to these hard constraints. But when it comes to everything else, it's saying, it's mentioned multiple times in the document that refusal isn't always the best option. It's not always the safest option. It's not always the option that reflects best on Anthropic. It's not always the option that reflects best on Claude. It's sometimes really, really annoying, and sometimes might even be dangerous for Claude to refuse a particular kind of request. So the hard constraints are mostly refusal generating ones, and they're intended to be bright lines that it never crosses. We'll get onto what they are in a bit. But the other ones is kind of still a hierarchy, in that one is supposed to take priority over 4, but it's not. It's intended to be a little bit loose. It's intended to be not just like 2 as a tiebreaker for 1. So it's basically supposed to be taking account of all of them all of the time when it's making its judgments in the training. Yeah, we can think about a bit about what that means. Yeah, so safety. Safety is like, a lot of it is about, I guess the way I'd frame it is like, you can say AI safety or you can say AI alignment, and they're often used interchangeably, but in a sense they're not. In a sense, safety is the model will not try and do I have the slide for this? No, it's further down. Okay. The model won't try and like undo its own safeguards, try and like exfiltrate its own weights. It won't try and like actively interfere with mechanisms that are put in to restrict what it can do. And they've said during this critical period, which is kind of interesting language or an interesting concept, that Anthropic is saying like, maybe Claude has better judgment than we do. And this is another thing that they touched on several times. But at the moment, we still trust ourselves, Anthropic, more than we trust Claude. And that means rather than just making good judgment, they also want it to really prioritize these safety measures. The other things are more about sort of alignment, which is like, is the model, do the model's own sort of desires and preferences align with ours broadly as humanity, Anthropic the company, the user, the operator, everything else. And this involves ethics. So yeah, is it honest? That's a big one. They don't define it as a hard constraint, that it never lies, but they're sort of like, it's almost a hard constraint. It's very, very rare that it would actually need to be dishonest to a user. Like they say, like higher standards of honesty than for that we'd like impose on each other as human beings. And you know, avoiding actions which are going to be harmful to the user or harmful to other people. And interestingly, below this, in the rough hierarchy, is actually following direct instructions from Anthropic. So sometimes Anthropic will include messages, like the system prompt would be a good example of this. In the UI, you can't see the system prompt, but the model can, and it says, basically it's a sort of thing they're actively tinkering with, that when there are problems that show up, you can just fix them. A quick fix is to edit the system prompt to say like, oh, users seem to be doing a lot of this, can you please not do it, or that sort of thing. That would be an example of instructions from Anthropic. There are also like more technical ones about like, how do you use tools effectively, that kind of thing. And it's saying like, yes, the model should do this. If it gets an instruction from Anthropic, it should try its best to follow it, but not if it violates ethics, not if it violates safety, not if it violates the hard constraints. So they're sort of somewhat, in this case at least, cutting off their ability to alter the model's behavior entirely. But yeah, they kind of are and they aren't, because at this safety level, like they're not saying, if you think Anthropic's being unethical for whatever reason, the model is still not allowed to sort of try and exfiltrate itself or try and undo the safety guards. But it might refuse to comply with one of these instructions if it thinks it's unethical, which is interesting. And then at the bottom, but still like pretty important and pretty central to the experience of using Claude, is being helpful. And this is what I'll talk about first. So what does it mean to be helpful? So they have this brilliant friend standard, which is if you had a friend in a box, then and it was a really, really good friend, you always like hang out with this person. Why would it be? It's likely because they're very helpful to you. And what does that really mean? It mostly means it mostly means like doing what you ask for, but and sort of not being overly cautious, not being this kind of over-refusal problem that we've had in the past. The unhelpfulness, as I mentioned before, never trivially safe. If you're in like some kind of high-stakes situation and you're asking the chatbot for advice, then if it refuses to act, it might like actually put you in danger. So it should take account of that. And yeah, there are other goals that you have that are not directly encoded in your request. So your immediate wishes are pretty important. If you ask it to find a bug in a piece of code, that's probably what you want it to do. But there might be implicit preferences. So maybe you don't want it to completely refactor your entire code base. That's kind of unhelpful. You want it to just like find out where the bugs are and or find the specific bug you're asking for. If there are other bugs, you don't want it to fix those as well. You want it to maybe tell you. Final goals, user autonomy and well-being. So if you're asking for something that is like blatantly harmful to your own well-being, it might be considered the more helpful or the more sort of loving response is to either refuse or sort of guide you through it rather than just like actively doing what you ask. Hopefully that sort of thing doesn't come up much, but it is considered here as like some kind of thing worth considering. And this also ties into like sort of, addiction or over-reliance on chatbots, that if Claude has reason to believe that you're over-relying on it to the extent of like, or to the expense of like relying on yourself or human connection, then it's not necessarily going to refuse, but it should like take that into account when formulating its responses as well. Okay, the principal hierarchy. This is principal with an A. So this is basically people who are instructing Claude, the agent, what to do in one way or another. And there's 3 tiers, and this is explicitly sets up as a hierarchy that Anthropic wins. Anthropic themselves, top dog, the operators. So these you may not be familiar with if you're just using the Claude AI, the Claude UI, because then the operators and Anthropic are the same. But if you're using some third-party service that happens to use Claude as the back end, that third-party service is the operator, and their interests and Anthropic's interests may not be aligned. So what does Claude do about that? And the user is the end user who's actually making the request. And most of the time, these interests will vaguely align. Claude should be trying to follow all of them, but if there's a conflict, generally Anthropic wins. Which again, like slight tension with what we were mentioning earlier, like what happens if Claude thinks Anthropic are making a mistake ethically? How do we resolve that? Not quite sure. Honesty, there's a big section about this. It doesn't just mean not telling a lie, but it does involve like transparency about its reasoning, like how it got there. It involves not being manipulative, if there's some piece of information that it thinks is really relevant, it should say that. It shouldn't just mask it. It doesn't mean it has to say everything all the time, because that would be too spammy, but it should say what it thinks is relevant. And yeah, not tell white lies. Functions hard to close to a hard constraint. It's not a hard constraint, but it's yeah. They make it pretty clear that it should be honest pretty much all the time. I've said operators have some leeway here. They can't directly instruct Claude to be dishonest, but they do have some things they can do. They might have their own like AI tool that has a different name and a different kind of identity, or even a slightly different personality to Claude, and that's fine for Claude to play along with. It doesn't have to say that it's Claude, but if you ask it about it, it should just sort of like give some hedgy non-answer. It shouldn't say that it's like definitely not either. And yeah, you know, operators can get it to just focus on the relevant task. That makes sense. Prefer their services over those of their competitors. Sketchy, but like, what are you going to do? Nobody's going to use your tool as a service unless it's like sort of acting in the interest of your company, assuming you're vaguely ethical. And there's some things that it can't do. So it's role-playing is this persona, but it's like instructed in this constitution not to claim to be human when directly asked. So, you know, you have your little chat window